Yep. Hey, my relatives. Good afternoon. This is Mark Charles. It is Friday, January 21st. And I am still drinking my second cup of coffee. I have been thinking about this cup of coffee and the things I want to talk about for a couple days now. And I thought I would be able just to get a few thoughts out and go real quickly. But of course, as always happens, once I begin doing some research and pulling some stuff together, I just was finding more and more information, and finally decided I just have to jump on and begin to talk about some of these things. So before I begin, I want to do as I always do, which is acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what's now known as Washington, D.C. But these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor my Piscataway relatives as the host people of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So, my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your generosity in allowing me to live here. So, this hasn't made major news, but it's been in the headlines a little bit. Of course, much of the news has focused this past week on what's going on in the U.S. Senate with the Democrats trying to pass voting rights legislation and not being able to do that because of their razor thin majority and the fact that they lost two senators in the bid to kind of change the way that the filibuster works. And so, even though all the Democrats supported the legislation, um, two of the Democrats did not support changing the filibuster rule, which allowed the minority, the Republicans, to block the legislation. And this is an important piece of legislation, right? Because Republicans legislators around the country in states around the country are literally working to block and limit the opportunity to vote for people of color. It's happening. It's very clearly happening, and it's important that this piece of legislation gets debated and that laws get enacted to stop what's happening. Um, this second cup of coffee is not to talk about that. I actually want to talk about what's going on and has been going on behind the scenes, and it's around the issue of critical race theory, but it's the way that state legislatures, again, have been working to kind of not only prohibit the use of critical race theory, but really to limit the debate and the discussion and even the teaching on race and racial history here in the United States, both in classrooms as well as in workplaces. Sorry, I'm really enjoying my coffee here. But one of the ways that this is seen most clearly right now is in a bill that is before the state legislature, the Senate in Florida. And it's a bill that would, again, limit the ability for classrooms to teach about race, as well as for workplaces to require training on discrimination or implicit racial bias or things like that because of the way the bill is worded. And so I'm going to share a few articles with you in here. The first is in the Miami Herald. And this article is titled Following DeSantis' Lead, Florida Lawmakers Take Aim at Race Discussions. And a few notable quotes out of this article is it talks about, and you might have heard there's been a lot of articles written this past week about how this bill um, restricts any sort of teaching or educational material that would cause a person to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or other psychological distress based on his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. That's actually in the wording of the bill. And so in this article, it states that the proposed legislation does not offer legal enforcement powers, but it seeks to restrict these discussions that would, again, make workers and students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. There's another article out there This one is by ABC News, and I'm going to share this in the comments section right now. Let me put this in there. And this article also goes into depth about this bill. It's SB 148, which is in front of the Florida Senate this week. And this article says it would bring politics into the classroom. They're quoting someone from the Florida Educational Association, President Andrew Spar, and he said it would bring politics into the classroom. It would chill speech and leave our teachers afraid to teach basic concepts like the idea that slavery is bad. He went on to say they reported that the legislation's sponsor appears to indicate Tuesday that under his bill, a teacher can cover the three-fifths compromise, which in the 1800s said that a black person would count as three-fifths of a white person, but they cannot express the idea that it is morally wrong to classify people of a certain color as being less than others. And so, again, one of the things that this bill tries to do is it tries to restrict the teaching of something based on how somebody feels because this is being taught. And this is where it gets really, really tricky. I'm actually going to share the bill with you, the text to the bill. It's SB 148, and it's titled "An Act Relating to Individual Freedom." And it says that this bill, this bill and legislation like this is really at the heart of Governor Ron DeSantis's legislative agenda. And so I'm going to go into that bill. I'll talk about it a bit more later in this live stream. But I want to talk about, I named this live stream, "The Second Cup of Coffee, Excuse Me, Governor DeSantis, but your implicit racial bias is showing." And I want to talk about how both the context and the wording of these laws demonstrate and a very distinct implicit, actually even an explicit racial bias by Governor DeSantis and by much of the legislators of the Florida Senate, especially the Republicans. And so part of the context is, right, this is not just a standalone bill. This is a part of a broader legislative agenda. And if you've been listening to Governor DeSantis's words and hearing his rhetoric, he is very much against critical race theory. And it was last June that they actually made the using of critical race theory in the classrooms illegal in the state of Florida. I'm going to share that story from the AP right here, and you'll be able to see that. And so that's the context, right? Is the state of Florida, led by Governor DeSantis, is really on a crusade to block critical race theory and to minimize and even remove any sort of meaningful discussion on racism and race here in the United States of America. And so that's the context of this. The other piece I want to raise, and for this I want to actually look a little bit more in depth at what is in this story. And so I want to bring up the bill for you so that you can see it. And let me go ahead and share it now on the screen. And we're going to go into bill. This is this is wording of the bill, the text of SB 148. And you can see this is just the header. I've copied and pasted some from this bill, and I put it into a text document so I can show it in a way that kind of summarizes it. But you see that this is a bill entitled "An Act Relating to Individual Freedom." And it's prohibiting the subjecting of any individual as a condition of employment, membership, certification, licensing, credentialing, or passing an examination to training, instruction, or any other required activity that espouses, promotes, advances, inculcates, or propels such individuals to believe any of the following concepts constitutes discrimination based on race, color, sex, or national origin under this section. So the first one is that members of one race, color, sex, or national origin are morally superior to members of another race, color, sex, or national origin. So it is illegal in the state of Florida to teach that one race is superior to the other race. Now, that's actually not a bad part of this law. However, that would actually require throwing out much of the educational material and legislation of educational material that our schools use. Because if you've heard me talk about this before, right, because of how American exceptionalism is at the center of our politics and our social life, and it holds that Americans are exceptional, and that exceptionalism is actually based on our whiteness, our race as a nation. Right, this would would make illegal much of what they're teaching already. It goes on. Another thing they're trying to prohibit is that an individual's moral character or status as either privileged or oppressed is necessarily determined by his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. Now, this is fascinating, right? Because this is not something that's up for debate. White privilege is literally the situation here. Well, it's not, again, I don't use white privilege, but what they call white privilege. White people have a different set of criteria that they're treated by based solely because of their race, the color of their skin. This has been embedded into the founding documents of our nation. It's in our Constitution. It's in our Declaration of Independence. It's in our Supreme Court case precedents. It is a fact that in the United States of America, if your skin is white, you will be treated differently than someone who is not white. And so to tell an individual that they are wealthy or they have opportunities or they have benefits or they have things that other people do not have solely because of their color of their skin is now illegal in the state of Florida. Again, this is fascinating. Another provision is that the history and content of the Declaration of Independence, including national sovereignty, natural law, self-evident truth, equality of all persons, limited government, popular sovereignty, and inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, and how they are the philosophical foundation of our government. So this is a second section of this bill that says this is what we need to teach. And so this is teaching that this is what the Declaration of Independence says. However, again, if you've listened to me talk, you know that the Declaration of Independence doesn't say these things. It does not teach the equality of all persons. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And the Constitution defines men as white landowners. This is not an accurate portrayal of what the Declaration of Independence says. But again, this is what the Florida educational system is required to teach, even though that's not what it says. 116, the meaning, history, significance, and effect of the provisions of the Constitution of the United States and amendments thereto, with emphasis on each of the 10 amendments that make up the Bill of Rights and how the Constitution provides the structure for our government. So again, this is stating how wonderful and great the Constitution is. Going into 130, line 130 of this bill, this is under a section 2, section B, I think, that says this is what the schools need to be teaching. That the history of the United States, including the period of discovery, again, calling it discovery, you can't discover lands already inhabited. That word implicitly implies Native peoples are less than human. The early colonies, the war for independence, the Civil War, the expansion of the U.S. to its present boundaries, the world wars, and the civil rights movement to the present, American history shall be viewed as factual, not as constructed, shall be viewable as knowable, teachable, and testable, and shall be defined as the creation of a new nation based largely on the universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. This is what they're supposed to be teaching according to this law in the state of Florida. Again, this is not an accurate portrayal of U.S. history. And even using the word discovery implies implicit racial bias. Now, what's mind-boggling about this is the very next section, section G, states that the history of the Holocaust from 1933 to 1945, the systemic planned annihilation of European Jews and other groups by Nazi Germany, a watershed event in the history of humanity, shall be taught in a manner that leads to an investigation of human behavior and understanding of the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping, and an examination of what it means to be a responsible and respectful person. So this is mind-boggling, right? Because what it's saying is we cannot teach our own nation's ethnic cleansing of Native peoples and enslaving of African people as morally wrong and an example of racism and white supremacy. But we can teach that this is what is going on, what went on in Nazi Germany. That's fascinating, right? That somehow what we did here, again, their language was, it was about applying universal principles in the building and constructing of a nation, which of course included the ethnic cleansing of Native peoples and the enslavement of African people. So we have to teach that genocide as wholesome and even God ordained, but we have to teach the Holocaust as morally wrong and an example of racism and white supremacy. This is where this bill is just flawed down to its very, very, very core. And this is what is the challenge this creates, right? Is how do you address this? How do you speak to someone like Governor DeSantis, who is terrified of the history of his nation being taught from the perspective of the marginalized, right? Because that's what critical race theory is. There's several tenets of critical race theory, depending on where you get your definition. Two of the very basic tenets is A, that racism, white supremacy in this country is not individual, it is systemic. It's a part of our institutions. And second, it's the history of this country as told, as narrated, as demonstrated by the voices of the people from the margins. See, the challenge is that history is written by the victors. Because the United States has never lost a war that's mattered, it's been able to write its own history for its entire existence. And it's terrified of listening to that same history taught through the lens of the people from the margins, because an entirely different narrative will begin to emerge. And so this deep fear that white America, and I'll say even white evangelicals, have of critical race theory is that it allows their myths to be exposed. Now, we could easily get into a very long discussion here about critical race theory and what we need to do about that, and I may bring that back for another discussion later. For the moment, I'm going to share with you a second cup of coffee that I did several months ago. I think it was last spring, when the critical race theory debate was kind of really coming out. And I'll just share with you, if you want to go back and listen to that live stream, that second cup of coffee, talking about critical race theory and how it threatens the myth of American exceptionalism. I invite you to go back and do that. But again, the question is, how do we address this, right? Even the Democrats in the Florida legislature they're saying, well, this is going to lead to a lot of very frivolous lawsuits because it's restricting something based on how it makes someone feel. And so, again, the fact, even the language and the way they're wording this bill shows you how implicit the racial bias of Governor DeSantis is, because the whole purpose of this bill is to limit or reduce or make illegal the use of critical race theory. And he's thinking about the way this will make white people feel. But he doesn't understand that people from the margins could choose much of what's already being taught in our schools, as this makes them or us feel uncomfortable. Someone is spamming us here, so I'm going to block this person. And now we're going to block them from Restream. Okay, sorry about that. Someone came on to show some spam here, and I just got rid of them. But so the way they worded this bill, because the way the authors felt threatened is when they were made to feel bad about themselves or about our nation because of its white supremacy and racism. They aren't thinking about the way that so many people of color can say, well, I actually feel uncomfortable when you teach the Declaration of Independence, which doesn't call for the equality of everybody, calls for the equality of white landowning men, and it literally calls natives savages, right? So let's not teach that. This is the same flawed thinking that white evangelicals have whenever they press to say we want to have prayer in public schools, right? They're not thinking that this will allow for a Muslim call to prayer to be in school. They're only thinking, no, the only prayer we want is a Christian prayer. And so because their own whiteness is so centered, they advocate for things that in the long run will actually end up going against their own agenda. Because, of course, in the US, allowing prayer in school would allow for all prayer in school. White evangelicals are not interested in a Muslim call to prayer going on in school. They're only interested in a Christian prayer going on in school. The same thing here, because whiteness is so centered, they're terrified about how the teaching of critical race theory makes them feel uncomfortable, as compared to thinking about how the teaching of our actual history in this nation and its implicit racial bias makes people of color feel. Why do you think people like Colin Kaepernick are kneeling during the singing of the national anthem, right? To highlight how inappropriate this song is in this diverse nation we're now living in. And so how do we respond to that? Because it's not the kind of thing you can debate or you can even argue with. Because once you start writing bills this way and once you start advocating for these things, you're not thinking clearly. And this is where I began talking about and understanding trauma, and how this is an example of trauma, a perpetration-induced traumatic stress at a multi-generational and communal level, right? This is where not only has the racism and white supremacy had a horrible traumatic impact on people of color, but the perpetrators of that history also are experiencing trauma. And so now they're trying to deal with their triggers by suppressing anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. And this is where I don't believe there's a legislative solution to this problem. This is where we have to actually address the psychological health of our nation. We have to address the trauma that is being experienced and exemplified by people like Governor DeSantis, and how he gets triggered by these things and begins reacting out of his out of his trauma. And so we're not going to solve it. And if we start trying to legislate these things, right, this is where it's just going to go crazy. And we're going to be we're going to just be flooded with a ton of lawsuits This problem can't be addressed legislatively, but we have to learn how to help white America come to terms with the history that they're standing on. The other deep flaw with this bill in front of the Florida legislature right now is that it's about making individuals feel discomfort, right? They want to make sure that no individual white person feels discomfort because of their race. And yet they also are terrified about racism as being identified as systemic. And again, this just demonstrates how they're so not thinking very clearly about this issue. And they're not even aware of what they're really fighting against. All they know is they feel uncomfortable, they want to stop. And so they're kind of blurting out these things without thinking clearly of what the ramifications of bills like this are and what the heart of the issue, what the center of the matter actually is. And it's not that we need to stop teaching these things, it's that we need to actually start teaching these things, right? If we understand the way trauma works, if we understand the way that our nation has been trying to suppress its history, not able to deal or talk about what it's done and what it's standing on, the solution to that discomfort is not continuing to ignore it and suppressing it even further. It's figuring out a way to talk about it, to own it, and to acknowledge it so that you can learn to live with yourself and begin to move forward. And so I don't know what the individual solution is for what's going on in Florida. It's not a legislative problem. They're trying to make it that, but they're only shooting themselves in the foot. It's a much deeper issue. And again, this is why I wrote this book, right? This is why I'm working so hard to help build common memory. This is why I'm so absolutely convinced the United States needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. Because if we don't learn how to talk about these things, if we don't learn how to address not only the historical trauma and the PTSD and the complex PTSD of people of color who were on the oppressed end of this history, but if we also don't learn how to address the perpetration-induced traumatic stress at a multi-generational and communal level of white America, we're never going to figure out how to move past this. We're going to stunt our growth as a nation. And we have, I would argue, stunted our growth as a nation for decades, if not centuries, because we don't know how to deal with this history. And so, one way or another, I would love to help Governor DeSantis understand the history of this nation, understand what it's built on, and help him come to terms with that so that we can actually move past it and build a better nation. But as long as he's allowed to, through legislation, continue to bury his discomfort, to remain in his state of denial about the white supremacy that he's standing on, we're never going to find a way to move forward. I hope this is helpful, my relatives. I'm again, there's not an easy solution here, right? This can't necessarily even be solved politically, except for the understanding of we need this national dialogue on race, gender, and class. I'm actually debating if I want to send Ron DeSantis one of my books and see if I could send him a signed copy of the book and encourage him to read it. Ask him if there's a way he'd be willing to sit down and look at this history and try and digest it and understand a little bit better. So that's one of the thoughts I'm having about it. So anyway, these are my thoughts this afternoon as I'm drinking my second cup of coffee. I hope in the next few weeks and months to have a better discussion on critical race theory, and maybe even bring on some guests to talk about critical race theory, as well as to talk about the trauma of white America, and maybe bring on some guests to talk about that. If you've been following me on social media, you'll know that I launched my Patreon page earlier this week, and the goal of that page is I'm calling myself a content creator, and the content I'm creating is not a specific podcast or blog or anything, but I'm really trying to create this national dialogue on race, gender, and class that we need as a nation. And if you're interested in learning more about my Patreon page, or even becoming a patron and subscribing to the work that I'm doing there, and some of the tiers that I have there, I welcome you to look at that. I'll put this into the comment section right now. But yeah, I'm really trying to use this as a way both to stabilize my income, as well as to grow this platform and to produce better content. I shared on my last live stream talking about this page that one of the things I'm trying to do with my Patreon site is to use it as a staging area, or even kind of a dress rehearsal of the content that I'm going to be putting out publicly. So if you want kind of a behind the scenes of, as I'm bringing these lectures together, as I'm looking at different things, and you want some more behind the scenes look at that, or some deeper Q&A and deeper discussion about that, you can subscribe to my work on Patreon. And right now we have 2 tiers up there, and we'll actually be starting them next week, where I have two Q&As scheduled for next week. I was hoping to do one today, but we ran out of time to pull it all together. But I'm hoping to have one next week Wednesday, and then another one next week Friday. But anyway, go to my Patreon page and check that out. And yeah, I hope everyone has a really good day. Oh, also, if you're interested, I'm going to share the link for people who want to get a signed copy of my book. You can get that on my website. And again, this is just a very good way of kind of helping people understand the history that we're standing on as a nation, and wrestling with what do we need to do to move this forward. So I hope this is helpful, my relatives. I hope this second cup of coffee gave you a few things to think about. And I welcome you to submit questions or thoughts and things on this. Or if you want, I'll be doing a Q&A about this next week on my Patreon page. If you want to go more in depth, feel free to subscribe to me there, and we can have a conversation there about ways we can continue to address this. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing where the discussion goes from here. Yeah, my relatives, I hope you have a really good afternoon. I hope you have a great weekend. Walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. And you know what? I almost forgot. I usually like to go through the comments. I'm trying to get better about acknowledging the people who are on here. So I see Adam is on today. Adam, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining. Anita is here, and she joined the Patreon group. Thank you, Anita, for joining there. That's fantastic. Michelle is here, saying we need you in Congress. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I live in Washington, D.C., and I can't join Congress from here. So I ran for president in 2020, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. But yeah, unfortunately, where I live precludes me from being a member of Congress at the moment. Todd, you're of German descent. Does that mean that teachers can't teach about the Holocaust because it might make your kids feel uncomfortable? That's a great comment. Again, this just shows how clearly they're not thinking through these issues. Andrea, you're on here. Thank you so much for joining, being part of this discussion, Andrea. It's great to have you on here. I want to thank everybody for joining today. And I really look forward to the discussions we'll be having next week on my second cups of coffee, and then the Q&As we're going to be doing on Patreon. So take care, my relatives. We'll talk again soon. Hakone.